So, welcome to episode 86 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And today we're going to talk about Frank Strazzeri's 1976 album After the Rain, which came out on Catalyst Records, which was a small little label which focused on jazz from the West Coast in the 1970s. So, this is the first pressing of this album, and in fact, it's the only pressing of this album from 1976. Probably would not have engendered much interest, but for the fact that it has one track which has become a kind of a holy grail of rare groove producers and DJs, which is the song Cloudburst, which is the last of the 6 songs in this record. That song has given this album kind of a cachet amongst the so-called crate digging community. Strazzeri himself is a pretty underrated keyboardist. He had a long career as a sideman, but he also has 20 albums under his own name, or just about 20 albums under his own name as well. In that career, he migrates from swing to cool jazz to bop to jazz funk and a whole bunch of other detours along the way. This album, as you can probably guess from the date, is very much in the jazz funk vein, although you'd have to say that of the 6 songs on here, 3 or 4, despite the jazz funk instrumentation such as electric bass and Fender Rhodes piano and so on, are very much small group bop numbers, and there are only 1 or 2 that actually probably fall into the category of jazz funk. I'd say that despite it being a small group, of the 6 players, 3 of them are multi-instrumentalists, so there's actually quite a range of sounds and varied textures in this album. So Frank Strazzeri is born in Rochester, New York. He dies in Rochester, New York, 84 years later in 2014. He started playing the clarinet and the sax when he was young. He had some issues with his heart. This is one of those weird doctor's orders things. He then changed to the piano from the reed instruments, I guess so he didn't have to blow so hard and maybe have some kind of incident. He went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, where he studies a variety of musical theory and studies in a very formal environment. In the early 1950s, he starts playing jazz around the clubs in Rochester. He gets a gig as a house pianist at a jazz club where he gets to accompany people like Roy Eldridge and Billie Holiday. He then moves to New Orleans and then to Las Vegas in the mid-1950s. And in Vegas, he gets to play with Woody Herman's big band, the so-called Thundering Herd, or whatever iteration that Woody Herman had at that particular time. Following Vegas, he then moves out west, and he arrives on the West Coast as the cool jazz scene is taking off. He moves to LA, and his proficiency and his compatibility as a sideman on piano becomes noticed, and he quickly becomes a favorite with a variety of producers and a variety of players. So he starts to play with the who's who of the cool jazz scene on the West Coast. So he's playing with Bud Shank, with Terry Gibbs, with Art Pepper, with Chet Baker, with whom he had a long stint, and a whole bunch of others. The list of people with whom this guy has played is actually enormous. As the 60s progress and as his own credibility increases, he begins to release his own albums starting in the late 1960s. By about 1974 or 75, he's released a number of pieces in what are basically jazz piano trio settings. One of the things about his career, though, is that he was extremely flexible and fit into the changing styles of jazz quite easily, much more easily than some of his contemporaries did. So by the early 1970s, jazz funk is huge. Electric instrumentation, people like Herbie Hancock and others have really popularized this, and he moves seamlessly from the acoustic piano to that classic jazz funk instrument, the Fender Rhodes electric piano. During this time, his output is getting funkier and funkier, but still retaining its foundation in bop, which was, if anything, was his home base. That was his home base musically. So After the Rain is recorded in Hollywood, and he brings together a bunch of people on this album who are almost without exception established side people who never really did much in a leading sense, but who all had really reputable careers in jazz for many decades. And that includes Don Elias, the percussionist. It includes Sam Most on flute and also on tenor sax, Bobby Shew on trumpet and flugelhorn, and a guy called Harvey Newmark on bass. On top of that, he brings in his son, Steve Strazzeri, on drums. And a side note on Steve Strazzeri, interestingly, he only appears on 4 albums, 3 of which are by his dad, and he's got 4th with another artist. He plays really well on this, and I can't help but wonder what happened to his career, whether some misfortune befell him or whether he just fell out of love with the industry. It's very difficult to find anything about him when you research, so there's a mystery there. But certainly Strazzeri Jr. plays extremely well on this record. There is some amazing Fender Rhodes playing here. One person who wrote about this album talked about Fender Rhodes fireworks, and they very much are all the way through. If you love the sound of the electric piano, which gets a bad rap these days, but has a very distinct and a very evocative sound for fans of music of this particular era, then you're going to love this record. So it starts off with the title track, After the Rain. This is kicked off with a beautiful flugelhorn riff from Shu, and then you get this lovely, airy, light flute solo from Sam Most. Sam Most, by the way, has a pretty good claim to the title of Godfather of Jazz Flute, for whatever that's worth. There's probably only two other serious competitors for that, Hubert Laws and Herbie Mann, but certainly when you listen to Most playing on this album, you can see why that claim might be made. After his solo, then it's Frank's first turn to tinkle away in the Fender Rhodes. This is a really gorgeous, gentle tune. For me, it's as good as anything which was coming out of the major jazz funk labels like CTI or Groove Merchant at the time. Really, really high quality stuff. Then there's Philadelphia Flyer, which is a longer workout. It's about 9 minutes in length. Not about hockey. It has a deep sort of synthy intro, and then you get a very nice little piece of riffing by the horn section. There's a kind of an urgent, intense drumming figure almost all the way through, provided by Steve Strazzeri. You've got solos from both horns and also from Frank, and you've also got superb bass lines, as you do pretty much all the way through this album. A very solid piece of jazz funk. And side one concludes with Rush Hour. This is also a pretty extended workout. It's an upbeat tune. The highlight here is the tenor solo from Most, and then a couple of really ripping solos, both from Shu and then from Strazzeri on the Fender Rhodes. And then that's the end of side one. Side two starts with Blue Dawn. You've got a slower tempo here. You have some interesting polyrhythms being laid down by the drums. Again, makes you wonder why Steve Strazzeri didn't have much of a career when I hear him playing here. This guy is no mug. That's followed by the Third Eye. Third Eye is a fast-paced bop tune, pretty much. A really superb driving bass pattern from Newmark, which is nicely anchored by Frank's Fender Rhodes. And then Most and Shu and then Strazzeri all have just sparkling solos, just like bang, bang, bang. This song probably has the most virtuosity of any song on the album, and it's a real tour de force, and it kind of leaves you breathless when you're done. But you need to collect yourself, because then you're on to the real masterpiece of this album, which is Cloudburst, which is nearly 10 minutes long and is reason enough to acquire this album just on its own. It starts off really gently on electric piano, a slow, simple little 6-note riff on bass, and then you get Shu coming in with a muted trumpet. So a minute in, this is no different than much of the rest of the stuff on the album, and there's no indication that the song is going to be the monster that it is. Then the drums kick in, and then Frank comes in on his piano, but he's got some kind of wah-wah effect, and this is just funk heaven. And there's a fantastic passage of music which goes on for about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, which just takes you to some other place. It's superb. There's congas, there's a sublime flute solo in the midst of this, there's synthy strings, and I can't say enough about the rhythm section here. Not just the drummer, who I've talked about, but also Newmark on bass. These guys were so tight, and they produce a feeling and an urgency and a warmth to this track that is really, really hard to capture. A lot of people tried in the 70s, and they aimed their dart at this bullseye on repeated albums, but surprisingly few groups really properly landed, and this is totally lightning in a bottle. Then the song goes back down to that simple figure again, and the tempo races again, and then you've got this epic flute solo as the song fades out. This is just glorious. You can see why producers and others were sampling this and digging for it and spinning it in clubs decades later. It really is up there with some of the great jazz funk tunes of the mid-70s. So what to say about After the Rain overall? Well, if you just listen to the first 5 songs, you've got a really interesting piece of small group bop played on 70s jazz funk instrumentation, which in itself I think is a pretty solid record, if not necessarily particularly spectacular. The inclusion of Cloudburst takes this to a whole another level. In some respects, I think you've kind of got two things going on here, because some would listen for the first 5 songs and others would listen for that last song. If you like both small group jazz but also really ripping jazz funk tunes that are club worthy, then you've got the whole package here. And for me, this is, for its rarity and for the quality of the playing and for its unsungness too, I think I have to give this 4.5 stars. Well worth the spin. hard to find, but dig it up on YouTube or SoundCloud or Spotify or wherever you need to, and give it a listen and crank it at your next party, and you will not be sorry.